50 million people. That's roughly the population of South Korea, or Spain, or an entire medium-sized country. Over the last 5 years, China says it has trained around 50 million people in digital skills and coding through state-backed education initiatives, vocational programs, online platforms, and local government campaigns. During the same period, the United States had a very different conversation. TikTok bans, Huawei sanctions, spy balloons, warnings about Chinese students, headlines about technological threats, congressional hearings with titles that sound less like industrial policy and more like military briefings. One country spent half a decade producing programmers. The other spent half a decade producing anxiety about programmers. And that's not the same thing. Because this isn't really a story about coding. It's a story about what nations teach themselves to do when they encounter competition. A country can decide to train engineers, or it can decide to train itself to be afraid of other countries' engineers. The distinction matters more than it sounds. Last year, China graduated more than 5 million students in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics-related fields. The United States graduated a fraction of that number. Even accounting for differences in population, the gap is difficult to ignore. China's Ministry of Education has spent years expanding vocational training, digital education programs, and university enrollment in technical disciplines. Provincial governments compete with one another to attract semiconductor firms, robotics companies, and AI laboratories. There's an old line in economics: incentives become outcomes. And China has spent years incentivizing technical competence. Meanwhile, Washington has spent years talking about technological competition while producing surprisingly little of the one thing every technology race eventually requires: people. Not press releases, not sanctions, not speeches about competitiveness. People who can sit in front of a screen for 8 hours and make difficult systems work. Because eventually, every industrial strategy, every AI dream, every semiconductor policy, and every military modernization program runs into the same bottleneck. You need engineers, a lot of them. Here's a number that doesn't get enough attention. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, America already faces shortages in multiple technical occupations, from software development to semiconductor engineering. Companies compete for the same limited pool of talent. Salaries rise, projects slow down, immigration becomes politically contentious, the pipeline tightens. China looked at the same problem and came to a different conclusion: make more engineers. It's almost aggressively simple. In 2021, Beijing launched another phase of its national digital economy strategy. Coding education expanded into primary and secondary schools. Vocational institutions were upgraded. Local governments partnered with companies like Tencent, Alibaba, and Huawei to deliver technical training at enormous scale. The scale is the point. A country of 1.4 billion people doesn't need every citizen to become an elite programmer. It just needs enough technically competent people to create depth. Depth is what matters. Because technological competition isn't won by finding 10 geniuses. It's won by having hundreds of thousands of competent people who can improve factories, write industrial software, design chips, optimize logistics networks, and build products that become slightly better every year. It's not glamorous. Neither was the Industrial Revolution. The uncomfortable question is whether America still understands this. Because if you listen to the political conversation, you could be forgiven for believing that China's rise is primarily a security problem. But what if it's also an education problem, or a labor problem, or a cultural problem? What if the real competition isn't over artificial intelligence models or advanced chips at all? What if it's over something much more basic? Who still believes engineering is a national mission? I keep coming back to one detail. In many Chinese cities, coding camps and robotics competitions are treated almost the way previous generations treated math Olympiads or national sports programs. Parents invest heavily, local governments sponsor events, companies provide equipment. There is a broad social assumption that technical competence leads somewhere. In America, we've somehow managed to make software engineers both highly paid and strangely suspect at the same time. Silicon Valley is blamed for social problems, automation, inequality, politics, even loneliness, sometimes deservedly. But nations are careful about the stories they tell themselves, because stories eventually become incentives, and incentives become outcomes. There's another number from the opening that we're going to come back to later, the 50 million. Because the important question isn't whether China's number is perfectly accurate. large government statistics always deserve scrutiny. The important question is this: what happens if it's even half true? Because if 25 million people were trained with useful digital skills in 5 years, that is still one of the largest technical workforce mobilizations in modern history. And if that's what's happening, then the argument between Washington and Beijing isn't really about technology anymore. It's about whether societies that fear competitors can still outbuild societies that are obsessed with becoming more capable. There is a habit in Washington of treating every Chinese technological success as a puzzle. How did they build electric vehicles so quickly? How did they become competitive in batteries? How did they catch up in drones? How are they producing advanced AI models despite export controls? The answer is usually less mysterious than people want it to be. They trained an enormous number of people. Then they put those people to work. A few years ago, I was reading through local government documents from provinces like Zhejiang and Guangdong. They're not exciting documents. Nobody makes documentaries about municipal workforce plans. But buried inside them are targets that tell you how Chinese officials think. Train another 100,000 technicians, expand vocational enrollment, create more industrial software specialists, partner with manufacturers, increase engineering graduates. It reads less like a grand geopolitical strategy and more like a factory manager's checklist, which, in a way, it is. Because China increasingly approaches national development like an engineering problem. You identify bottlenecks, you allocate resources, you build capacity, then you repeat the process. The West often mistakes this for some kind of secret master plan. Sometimes it's just administration, a slightly boring, relentlessly persistent kind of administration. There is a reason China's electric vehicle industry didn't emerge from nowhere. Companies such as BYD and CATL did not wake up one morning and discover they had world-class engineers. Those engineers were produced over years through universities, technical institutes, supplier networks, and industrial ecosystems. A battery factory doesn't just need battery scientists. It needs maintenance technicians, software engineers, chemical engineers, machine operators, quality control specialists, supply chain analysts, thousands of people with different skills, all stacked on top of each other. The phrase industrial ecosystem sounds abstract until you realize it really means millions of human beings who know how to make complicated things. This is where the 50 million matters, because talent compounds. A software engineer teaches another engineer. A company spins off 3 startups. Suppliers train workers who later become managers. Universities create research partnerships. An ecosystem develops memory. And institutional memory is hard to sanction. The United States understands this better than anyone because it did exactly the same thing after the Second World War. The GI Bill expanded education. Federal research funding transformed universities. Defense spending created entire industries. America didn't become a technological superpower because it had better slogans. It became one because it built a machine that produced scientists and engineers at extraordinary scale. People forget this. The internet came out of government-funded research. GPS came out of government-funded research. Modern semiconductors were heavily supported by defense spending. The United States spent decades training people and building institutions before it became fashionable to talk about innovation. Then something changed. Somewhere along the way, America started talking as though innovation simply appears, as though talented people emerge naturally, as though manufacturing and engineering ecosystems can be rebuilt by announcing a strategy every election cycle. They can't. These things take years, sometimes decades, and this is where the fear narrative becomes costly, because fear changes incentives. Imagine you're an 18-year-old deciding what to study. You hear that globalization is dangerous. You hear that manufacturing is leaving. You hear that artificial intelligence may replace programmers. You hear constant warnings about technological disruption. Then you hear that engineers are desperately needed. What exactly are you supposed to conclude? Meanwhile, in another country, the message is remarkably direct. Learn technical skills. The state wants them. Companies want them. Your parents want them. The labor market wants them. The signal is clear. Signals matter. One of the least discussed stories in recent years is the explosion of vocational education in China. Not everyone there is becoming a software engineer at a major tech company. That's a misunderstanding. Many are becoming technicians, industrial coders, factory automation specialists, the people who keep robots running. And here's the thing about modern industry. Those jobs matter almost as much as elite researchers. A semiconductor plant with brilliant scientists and no technicians is just a very expensive building. A drone company with excellent ideas and insufficient manufacturing talent becomes a case study in frustration. The Pentagon understands this. That's why recent reports increasingly talk about workforce shortages, not just weapon systems. Even the semiconductor race keeps returning to the same issue. Who will operate the fabs? Who will write the industrial software? Who will maintain the machines? The machines need people. This sounds obvious. It apparently wasn't. There's also a strange irony here. The United States keeps describing China as its primary technological competitor, while simultaneously making it harder to import high-skilled talent, harder to train enough domestic engineers, and politically difficult to expand technical immigration. That is a complicated way of saying you need more engineers. At some point, arithmetic begins to intrude on ideology, and arithmetic is very stubborn. I should add a caveat here because complexity matters. Training millions of people does not automatically produce innovation. Quantity can become bureaucracy. Degrees can become credentials without competence. China has its own problems: youth unemployment, inefficient investment, mismatches between graduates and available jobs. Those criticisms are real, but they don't erase the underlying trend. Because even if only a fraction of these programs succeed, the numbers are still enormous. And that leads to a question I don't think enough people are asking. What happens when a country with a huge manufacturing base also develops a huge technical workforce at the same time? Because if that combination starts reinforcing itself, we're not talking about catching up anymore. We're talking about something else entirely. Remember that phrase from earlier? Depth is what matters. This is where it starts to become uncomfortable. Because most discussions about technology competition focus on the frontier, the newest AI model, the fastest chip, the latest breakthrough. The frontier is exciting. It also employs relatively few people. The real economy lives behind it. Factories, warehouses, industrial software, electrical grids, ports, machine tools, the unglamorous infrastructure of modern civilization. And China's wager over the past decade has been that if you build enough technical depth, breakthroughs become easier because the entire system gets better at solving problems. The evidence is increasingly difficult to dismiss. Take industrial robots. China installed more industrial robots in 2023 than the rest of the world combined. Not because Chinese factories are uniquely futuristic, but because labor costs have risen and manufacturers need productivity gains. The response wasn't to hold conferences about competitiveness. It was to buy robots and train people to use them. The same pattern appears in electric vehicles. The same pattern appears in renewable energy. The same pattern appears in drones. Everywhere you look, there is an ecosystem effect. One industry feeds another. Battery engineers help electric vehicles. Electric vehicles improve power electronics. Power electronics improve robotics. Robotics improve manufacturing. The system starts teaching itself. And systems that teach themselves are difficult to compete against. This is the part where someone usually objects. China has a demographic crisis. True. Its working-age population is shrinking. Youth unemployment is high. Also true. Many graduates struggle to find jobs. Again, true. These are serious problems. But they don't necessarily lead to the conclusion people want. In fact, they may point in the opposite direction. A shrinking workforce increases the incentive to automate. A surplus of graduates lowers labor costs for employers. Economic pressure pushes people toward technical industries. Paradoxically, some of China's weaknesses may reinforce its industrial strategy. That is the reversal. The problems that many observers expected to slow China's technological development may actually accelerate parts of it. Not all of it, not uniformly, but enough to matter. I keep thinking about a company called Unitree Robotics. 5 years ago, almost nobody outside the robotics world had heard of it. Today, it builds quadruped robots and humanoid systems at prices that surprise competitors. Its founder came out of the Chinese university system, hired local engineering talent, and benefited from a supply chain that already existed. The company itself isn't the story. The ecosystem that made the company possible is. Silicon Valley understands this better than almost anyone. That's why so many American technology executives worry less about individual Chinese firms and more about the scale of Chinese engineering capacity, because eventually scale becomes optionality. A country with millions of technically trained workers can afford experiments. Most experiments fail. That's fine. You only need a few to work. The United States used to understand this instinctively. Think about the 1950s and 1960s. America built universities, laboratories, defense programs, space programs, and research agencies simultaneously. It produced redundancy, multiple paths to success. Today, American discussions often sound different. There is a tendency to search for a silver bullet, one subsidy, one bill, one strategic industry, one breakthrough company. The problem is that ecosystems don't work that way. They're messy, they're inefficient, they're full of duplication, and that's exactly why they're resilient. Here's a number worth sitting with for a moment. According to estimates from the World Economic Forum and various labor studies, the global economy may require hundreds of millions of workers with new digital skills by the end of this decade. Hundreds of millions. The competition is not for a few thousand elite AI researchers. It's for the middle layer, the technicians, the coders, the engineers who make systems function. This is where the story becomes larger than China and America, because every major economy is running into the same question. Who will build the next industrial era? And perhaps more importantly, who is still training people for it? I have a doubt that I can't quite shake. Have we become so obsessed with the geopolitical competition itself that we've stopped asking why one side appears willing to produce engineers at extraordinary scale, while the other increasingly talks about managing decline, reducing dependence, and limiting risk? Risk management is important. Security matters. Some Chinese companies absolutely raise legitimate concerns. But there is a difference between protecting yourself and slowly convincing yourself that your competitors' capabilities are the entire story. They aren't. Your own capabilities matter too, possibly more, because history is full of powers that correctly identified a rival and still lost the competition. Not because they misunderstood the rival, because they neglected themselves. And when you put the pieces together, the 50 million trainees, the manufacturing base, the educational expansion, the automation drive, you begin to see a possibility that many people still resist. Maybe China's most important advantage isn't its state planning. Maybe it isn't subsidies. Maybe it isn't even scale. Maybe it's something simpler. Maybe it still believes that technical competence is a national project worth pursuing together. And if that's true, then the question hanging over this entire story becomes much harder to answer. Let's go back to that number, 50 million. I don't know if the exact figure is right. Frankly, neither do you. And neither do many of the people repeating it. Large national statistics always deserve skepticism. But I've spent enough time looking at Chinese education policy, provincial workforce plans, and industrial output to be comfortable saying something narrower. The direction is real, the scale is real, and the intent is unmistakable. China made a decision. It decided that technological competition would ultimately be won by producing more technically capable people than its rivals, not by producing better speeches about innovation, not by assuming market forces would sort everything out, not by hoping someone else would train the engineers, by treating human capital as infrastructure. That phrase sounds dry, almost bureaucratic. It's also one of the most important ideas in economics. A bridge lets goods move. A port lets containers move. A skilled workforce lets an entire civilization solve problems faster. And unlike a bridge, a trained engineer can create more engineers. That compounding effect is why countries that get ahead in technical capability often stay ahead for surprisingly long periods. This doesn't mean China is destined to win. History isn't that neat. It has a debt problem. Local governments are under financial pressure. Its property sector is still dealing with the aftermath of years of excess. Private companies complain about regulation. Demographics remain a serious challenge. There are many ways this story could become messier than either Beijing or Washington expects. But there is another mistake that I think Americans increasingly make. They confuse friction with failure. A Chinese company struggles? Proof that the model is collapsing. The economy slows? Proof that the rise is over. A demographic problem appears? Proof that history has been canceled. Countries don't work like that. The United States had recessions, political crises, inflation, social upheaval, and strategic mistakes throughout the 20th century. It still became the world's dominant technological power. Large societies can absorb a lot of damage if they keep producing capability. That's the variable I keep coming back to, capability. Because the uncomfortable possibility is that we're measuring the wrong thing. We count sanctions, we count export controls, we count speeches and strategy documents. Meanwhile, another country counts engineers. One of those metrics may turn out to matter more than the others. There is also a deeply human dimension to this. A society eventually becomes what it rewards. Reward speculation long enough and people speculate. Reward bureaucracy long enough and people become bureaucrats. Reward technical competence long enough and more people decide to become technically competent. Culture isn't abstract, it's accumulated incentives, and incentives become outcomes. My opinion is straightforward. America's problem is not that China trained millions of coders. America's problem is that it increasingly treats engineering as a sector instead of a national mission. Those are very different things. The United States still has extraordinary universities, world-class companies, deep capital markets, and an unmatched ability to attract talent from around the world. None of that has disappeared. But advantages decay when they are assumed to be permanent. I also have a question that I don't think either political party has answered. If the next industrial era is built on AI, robotics, advanced manufacturing, and software-defined systems, where exactly are the millions of additional engineers supposed to come from? Because every serious strategy document eventually arrives at the same destination: more chips, more factories, more infrastructure, more AI, more energy. All of it requires people. There is no shortcut around that arithmetic. As for my prediction, I think the next decade will be less about a race for individual technologies and more about a race for technical populations. The countries that train, attract, and retain engineers at scale will steadily pull ahead. Not every year, not in every sector, but gradually, almost quietly. And the countries that spend more time discussing their competitors than producing their own talent will discover something unpleasant. Fear is not an industrial policy. It never has been. The irony is that this entire story began with coders, but it isn't really about coding at all. It's about whether a civilization still believes it can build. Because once a society loses that confidence, rebuilding it is much harder than training 50 million programmers. If you enjoyed this one, send it to someone who still thinks technology competition is mainly about chips and sanctions. The numbers suggest it's also about classrooms, vocational schools, and a very old idea that never went out of fashion in some places. Teach enough people how to make things, and eventually they do.